Welcome to Hopeful Heart Stories, where every story sparks courage, ignites hope, and proves that no dream is impossible. Let your heart rise.
The headquarters of Genevan Medical Technologies gleamed with innovation and success. Its glass walls reflecting the confidence of a company that had climbed to the top of the biotech world. Yet beneath the polished surfaces and carefully curated mission statements, something darker lingered. On the 27th floor, where executives discussed growth strategies and global expansion, resentment had quietly taken root. It gathered not among the overworked interns or the late-night researchers, but among three mid-level managers who believed the future owed them more than it had given. They watched Daniel Reed rise faster than any of them ever had. To the rest of the company, he was everything leadership should be: steady, attentive, and principled. He was the widowed father who never missed a school event, the executive who remembered names, who stopped to help maintenance staff, who treated everyone with the same calm respect regardless of title. His reputation wasn't built on loud ambition, but on quiet consistency. And that, to Kyle, Bonnie, and Max, felt unbearable. In their eyes, no one reached that level without calculation. Kindness, they believed, was a strategy, not a virtue. Daniel's patience had to be rehearsed. His humility had to be an act. They convinced themselves that his warmth was nothing more than a polished performance designed to impress the board. After all, they had worked just as long, sacrificed just as much, or so they told themselves. Promotions had passed them by. Recognition had thinned. And watching Daniel inch closer to national leadership felt less like inspiration and more like theft. What truly unsettled them was not Daniel's success, but how effortlessly he carried it. He never bragged. He never rushed past people. He never seemed afraid of slowing down. To those who lived by sharp elbows and guarded smiles, that kind of calm felt unnatural. Suspicion hardened into certainty. No one could be that decent when the stakes were real. So they decided to test him, not with deadlines or performance reviews, but with something far more personal. They wanted to place Daniel in a situation where politeness would no longer be convenient, where compassion would demand effort, patience, and vulnerability. If his kindness was an illusion, they reasoned, it would crack under discomfort. And if it shattered publicly, they would finally have proof that the man everyone admired was no different from the rest of them. Their plan was cruel in its simplicity. A blind date, arranged anonymously, filmed secretly, designed not for connection but for exposure. They chose someone they believed would challenge Daniel's composure, a woman who was deaf, assuming he would grow awkward, frustrated, or quietly retreat. They didn't see her as a person. They saw her as a tool. And in doing so, they crossed a line they barely acknowledged. As they finalized the details, smug confidence replaced doubt. They told themselves this wasn't malice, just fairness, a necessary unveiling. In their minds, they weren't orchestrating humiliation. They were revealing truth. What they failed to understand was that truth does not bend to intention, and that the test they created would not expose Daniel Reed at all. It would expose them. Daniel Reed arrived at the restaurant earlier than necessary, a habit shaped by years of responsibility and quiet discipline. He stood just outside the entrance for a moment, adjusting his jacket, steadying his breath. This wasn't a boardroom negotiation or a quarterly briefing. This was personal, and that difference made his pulse quicken. Somewhere in the back of his mind, his daughter's voice echoed, reminding him to smile, reminding him that showing up mattered. Carrying that thought with him, he stepped inside. The restaurant glowed with warm light and soft conversation, the kind of place designed to make people linger. Daniel was led to a corner booth where he sat upright, hands folded loosely, glancing toward the entrance more often than he meant to. When the door opened again, Lena Park walked in. She moved with a calm deliberateness, her eyes alert, scanning faces and mouths with practiced focus. There was a quiet confidence in her posture, but also a careful caution, as though experience had taught her not to expect much. Daniel noticed immediately, not with surprise, not with discomfort, but with understanding. He recognized the subtle cues, the way her gaze followed lips, the way she paused before responding. He didn't hesitate or look away. When Lena approached the table, he stood, met her eyes, and greeted her in sign language. The simple gesture shifted everything. Lena stopped short, her composure faltering for just a breath. For a moment, she stared at him as if trying to confirm what she had seen. Then something softened in her expression, something guarded easing open. She returned the greeting, her movements careful at first, then steadier. The tension she had carried into the room began to loosen, replaced by cautious relief. As they sat, conversation unfolded naturally. Daniel spoke and signed together, his movements unforced, his attention fully on her. There was no exaggeration in his expressions, no performative slowness, no trace of impatience. He didn't center her deafness as an obstacle or a novelty. It was simply part of how they communicated, no more defining than the cadence of a voice or the color of a smile. Lena found herself watching him closely, not out of suspicion, but curiosity. She had grown used to the familiar patterns: people who smiled too brightly, spoke too loudly, or retreated into awkward politeness. Daniel did none of those things. He listened with his eyes, responded with care, and allowed pauses to exist without rushing to fill them. For the first time in a long while, she felt no pressure to perform or reassure. When the waiter spoke, Daniel seamlessly translated, signing each detail with clarity and ease. It was such a small act, yet it carried weight. Inclusion without announcement, respect without display. Lena chose her meal, not because she was guided, but because she was informed. That distinction mattered more than he could have known. As the minutes passed, the edges of the evening softened. Laughter came easily, shared in glances and expressions as much as sound. What had begun as a blind date between two strangers slowly became something quieter and rarer, a meeting grounded in presence. Without realizing it, both of them settled into the simple comfort of being seen. And in that space, something genuine began to take shape. The evening continued to unfold with an ease that neither of them tried to manufacture. Plates arrived, candlelight flickered gently between them, and the noise of the restaurant faded into a distant hum. Daniel moved naturally between speaking and signing, never drawing attention to the effort it took, never making Lena feel as though she required special handling. His focus stayed steady, attentive, grounded in the moment they were sharing rather than in how it might appear to anyone else. Lena spoke about her work, about writing stories for organizations that served people who were often overlooked. Her hands moved more freely as she signed, her expressions becoming animated as she described why she cared so deeply about giving voice to those who were rarely heard. Daniel listened without interruption, his eyes following every movement, his nods slow and deliberate. There was no urge to redirect the conversation back to himself, no subtle impatience, just presence. When she finally spoke of her past dating experiences, the tone shifted. She described how conversations often ended quickly once people realized she was deaf, how smiles turned stiff, how interest dissolved into polite excuses. 12 times, she explained. The pattern had repeated itself. She wasn't bitter when she shared it, just honest. The honesty hung between them, unadorned and vulnerable. Daniel didn't rush to fill the silence that followed. He didn't offer rehearsed sympathy or easy reassurance. He let the pause exist, acknowledging her truth by giving it space. His response came not through grand words, but through the way he remained fully engaged, signaling that her experience mattered, that she didn't need to minimize it for his comfort. Then the accident happened. A waiter stumbled slightly while passing their table, and in a moment of clumsy motion, Lena's water glass tipped over. The spill spread quickly across the tablecloth, soaking the hem of her dress. Lena startled, her hands instinctively moving to contain the mess, her shoulders tightening as years of unwanted attention resurfaced all at once. Daniel reacted without hesitation, but not with urgency that would draw eyes. He stood calmly, retrieved a handkerchief, and knelt beside her with quiet care. His movements were respectful, measured, and mindful of her space as he gently blotted the fabric. There was no apology heavy with embarrassment, no fuss designed to reassure onlookers. He treated the moment as what it was, an accident. Nothing more. When he draped his jacket over her shoulders, it was done simply. Without flourish. He signed that she was fine, that there was nothing to be ashamed of. The message carried far more weight than the gesture itself. It told her she hadn't disrupted the evening. Hadn't become a burden. Hadn't shifted the atmosphere in a way that required recovery. Across the room, unseen by them, the watchers grew silent. The discomfort they had anticipated never arrived. Daniel's kindness did not falter under inconvenience. It sharpened into clarity. There was no performance to expose, no crack to capture. What unfolded was consistent, unguarded, and undeniably real. As Daniel returned to his seat and the conversation resumed, Lena felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not excitement or infatuation, but safety. The kind that comes from realizing someone's character does not depend on ideal conditions. In that moment, kindness was no longer theoretical. It was proven. What began as a single evening slowly extended beyond the walls of the restaurant, unfolding not in dramatic declarations, but in quiet, deliberate steps. Daniel and Lena did not rush to define what they were building. Instead, they allowed it to grow naturally, shaped by shared presence rather than expectation. Conversations continued, sometimes over dinner, sometimes through messages filled with patient exchanges of words and signs. With each interaction, something fragile yet resilient took form: trust. The first time Lena visited Daniel's home, she noticed how lived in it felt. Toys were scattered in corners, drawings taped to the refrigerator, small signs of a life built around care rather than control. Ruby, curious and unfiltered, approached her without hesitation. Her hands moved slowly, clumsily forming the few signs she had learned. Her eyes bright with determination. The effort alone stirred something deep in Lena. No one had ever tried that hard for her so quickly. Without being asked, Lena knelt to meet Ruby at eye level, responding with gentle corrections and encouragement. What followed wasn't a grand bonding moment, but something more genuine: shared laughter, imperfect communication, and the freedom to be unpolished. Ruby wasn't careful in the way adults often were. She didn't tiptoe around silence or treat it as something fragile. To her, it was simply another way of being together. Daniel watched from a distance at first, his expression thoughtful. He had spent years guarding his world, careful about who he allowed close to his daughter. Yet there was no tension in the room, no sense of intrusion. The house, once defined by quiet routines and memories, felt fuller without becoming chaotic. The silence that had once echoed with absence now held warmth. As weeks passed, shared moments accumulated. There were evenings of simple meals, afternoons in the park, and small domestic failures that turned into inside jokes. Lena found herself relaxed in ways she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. She wasn't constantly scanning for signs of impatience or withdrawal. She wasn't bracing for the moment she would need to explain herself again. In this space, she was allowed to exist as she was. For Daniel, the shift was just as profound. He had loved deeply before and lost painfully. Opening his life again hadn't felt risky until it was already happening. Watching Lena teach Ruby new signs, seeing his daughter's pride in being understood and understanding in return, awakened something he had carefully kept quiet. This wasn't replacement or repair. It was addition, something new growing alongside what had already been. Ruby, in her honest simplicity, named what the adults circled carefully. One evening, half asleep and unguarded, she signed a word she had learned recently: family, and looked between them with certainty. There was no question in her expression, only acceptance. The word landed gently but firmly, settling into a truth neither Daniel nor Lena could ignore. Healing didn't arrive as a single moment of clarity. It came through repetition, through consistency, through choosing one another in small ways every day. In that rhythm, pain softened without being erased, and love took shape not as a rescue, but as a shared path forward. Time did what it often does best: it allowed meaning to deepen. Months passed, marked not by milestones announced out loud, but by familiarity settling into place. Daniel, Lena, and Ruby moved through their days with a quiet confidence that came from knowing where they belonged. There was no urgency to prove anything to the world. What mattered had already taken root in the ordinary moments they shared. When they returned to the restaurant where everything had begun, it felt less like revisiting a memory and more like acknowledging a turning point. The space looked the same, the lighting just as warm, but the weight it once carried was gone. This time, there were no hidden eyes, no unspoken tests, only choice. They sat together easily, Ruby between them, her legs swinging beneath the table as she studied the room with thoughtful curiosity. What happened next unfolded gently, almost reverently. Ruby stood, her small hands moving with careful concentration as she signed the words she had practiced in secret. The question was simple, yet it carried a depth far beyond her years. When Lena understood, emotion rose quickly, not as shock but as recognition. She had already been living the answer long before it was asked. Daniel followed, not with grand speeches, but with honesty. His words held no desperation, no need to fill absence. He spoke of addition, of how life expands when shared with the right person. The ring he offered reflected that same simplicity, unassuming. Thoughtful, chosen with care rather than display. Lena's response needed no embellishment. Her yes came freely, grounded in certainty rather than fear. From that moment on, the shape of their family became visible to the world. But it had been real long before. Planning followed quiet evenings discussing details, Ruby insisting on being involved in every decision. Laughter filling rooms that once held only routine. Lena stood before mirrors, not searching for perfection, but recognizing herself in a future she once believed was close to her. Daniel watched his daughter thrive, her confidence blooming as communication grew into something joyful rather than careful. Their days was still imperfect. Cookies burned, schedules clashed, silence sometimes returned, but now it was companionable, never empty. They chose each other not once, but repeatedly in patience, in understanding, in the willingness to keep learning. Sign language flowed more easily through their home, not as a necessity, but as a shared language of care. On quiet nights, when Ruby slept between them during movie marathons or weekend naps, Daniel would look at Lena and recognize something steady and rare. This wasn't a love built on rescue or sacrifice. It was built on seeing and being seen. Without conditions, Lena, too, felt the shift. The question that had once haunted her, whether she was difficult to love, no longer surfaced. It had been replaced by knowing. What they built together did not erase the past. It honored it. Loss, difference, and vulnerability became part of the foundation rather than obstacles to overcome. Their story did not declare itself loudly, but it endured in choosing one another. Again and again, they proved that family is not something assigned. It is something created, patiently, in trust and in love.